Hello everybody, in today's video I'm taking you on a little bit of a nostalgic journey of what it was like growing up in some of the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona in the 1970s and the 1980s. I'm going to describe what it was like as a kid living in Chandler and Gilbert, Arizona, what I experienced during my childhood, my teenage years, and my college years, and tell you how it's similar to some of the things that you might see today and how there is very big differences, just in case you're thinking of moving into Arizona and bringing your family. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to compare what some of the northern Arizona towns that I live in now are like, how they are similar to what Chandler and Gilbert was like in the 1970s, and just give you all the information because I'm feeling a little bit nostalgic and I feel like taking you on this reminiscent trip from Phoenix in the 1970s and 80s. Before we begin, my name is Dawn Dickinson. I am a licensed real estate agent in the state of Arizona. If you're ever interested in buying or selling a home in the state of Arizona, please reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation with you. My contact information is always in the description below. You can give me a call or a text or an email and I will get back to you. So my family moved to Chandler, Arizona in 1970, just a few weeks before my 6th birthday. And it was really exciting for me because we were coming from Long Island, Hicksville, New York, but my parents were both from Brooklyn, so they were very much New Yorkers, and I was just a little kid. My brother was very young, and my sister hadn't been born yet. We landed in Chandler, and at that time, 1970, the population of Chandler was like 63,000 residents, which is way different today when we are pushing over 280,000 people living in Chandler. So we had settled in Chandler. We actually lived for a couple of years in actually a travel trailer in a mobile home park, and then we upgraded to a 1970 single wide mobile home for a while, and then eventually my father built a fourplex in Chandler, and then eventually past then we moved into like a real house. So kind of did jump around a little bit. Now one thing that I seem to notice is in the 70s it seemed like the population in Gilbert and Chandler were much more poor than they are today. Now I don't know if that is real. It does seem like a lot of the houses they've built were attracting a more affluent population. So I don't know if just more people were poor in the 70s and 80s in Phoenix, or we were just poor, and that's what I noticed because that's where we were living. So that was something very interesting. My father actually had very humble beginnings, but was a very hard worker, a good businessman, and by the time he died, he had actually built up a very good, standard of living, had a beautiful home in Ahwatukee that was custom neighborhood in a very prestige area. So, but when we started out, we were pretty poor. So I don't know if that's just what the observation was because where we were living, or if basically Chandler and Gilbert was much more poor and has become more affluent today, which is more likely what's going on. There was a very small population and they have built a lot of big, nice, beautiful homes in these two cities. So it may just be that that's what has moved in, and the people that you see now when you're in Chandler and Gilbert are much more affluent than what they were in the 1970s. Now, in 1970, Gilbert, Arizona had a population of less than 2,000. It was like 1,900. And when I was in about 5th grade, we moved from Chandler to Gilbert, and at that point there were maybe 6,000 residents in Gilbert. Now by the time today comes, there's about 275,000 residents. So imagine the population growth here in the last 50 years. We've gone from, say, Gilbert 2,000 to 275,000. So the towns probably have had some growing pains. And that is actually part of the reason I left and moved to northern Arizona, is because the population has just exploded. There's people everywhere. There's a lot of traffic. We didn't have any of that back in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, you would have small roads. Actually, Alma School Road, any of you who are from Phoenix, Alma School Road was a dirt road when we moved here. And we lived in an area, we lived in a trailer park. There were alfalfa fields behind us. They used to bring the sheep in the wintertime. The sheep would graze. Occasionally you'd be driving driving on Alma School Road or Ray Road, and you would have to stop because farmers were bringing in their giant herds of sheep to migrate for the season. So none of that stuff happens today, but at the time that seemed normal. Now, between the towns, like between, say, Chandler and Gilbert or Gilbert and Mesa, there would be miles of roads where you had alfalfa fields, cornfields, cotton fields, definitely separation between the towns. But today it's all one giant sprawled out suburb, and in fact we have moved out to like Santan Valley, Queen Creek, where there was pretty much nothing back in the day. And in fact, as you would go east, it would kind of end, and you would take Elliott Road out to the end. It would be a dirt road, and there would be desert. And back in high school, we used to have keg parties out at the end of Elliott Road, which is hysterical because now you go forever. But that would be the big desert party, which my parents didn't know about. I mean, they didn't know we were going to parties, but if they had a clue. And in those days, you would have parties. So like, say, 1980-ish, when I was able to drive, really not a lot of bad stuff would go on. Now, I'm sure there was underage drinking. I was not a beer drinker. I could never stand beer. So they would bring a keg. I wouldn't drink any because I thought beer was disgusting. There was not a lot of alcohol. There's not a lot of drugs. People didn't die of fentanyl or any of that kind of stuff back then. So again, it was safer, although I know there was mischief going on, but nothing like the kind of stuff that kids get into trouble with today. Now, when I think about the school system, schools were very small, or at least, where I went into Chandler, I went to, Gilbert High School in the early 1980s. I think we had less than 1,000 students. My graduating class had about just over 100 students, so very small, but that kind of was a disadvantage. I mean, it was nice to be in a small school where you had a favorable student to teacher ratio, but you didn't have a lot of the nice programs that other schools had. You didn't have a lot of technology stuff. Not that there was technology, right? But you didn't have a lot of that stuff. In fact, they didn't have any honors classes when I was in high school until I had made all my requirements, and then they started bringing in honors English and honors history and honors science, but they didn't have any honors. Now, they did have a gifted program. I was in the gifted program, but gifted program was kind of funny because it was kind of like free-for-all. It replaced English and reading, and basically the teacher would just do creative projects for the students. So really wasn't very structured. So you didn't have the honor stuff. Now, of course, by the time I graduated in the early 1980s, they were bringing in some of these new, more advanced programs. But they did have good programs that you don't see today. Shop. They had FFA, they had home ec, they had tons of theater. Now, I was a theater geek. I did hang out with the theater kids and the nerds. So you also had different little cliques, and I know there are cliques today. You had the cowboys, a lot of cowboys, because there were, again, a very rural community. A lot of people lived in ranches where they had horses and cows and chickens. So you did have a lot of the cowboys hanging out. You had FFA programs, Future Farmers of America. You had the jocks, the people that were into sports. Now, I was never into sports. I am the most unathletic person on the earth, especially if it comes to hitting balls or, hitting a tennis ball, a golf ball, a baseball. Oh, God forbid I would have to get a basketball into the hoop. The worst terror of my life is when we had to make softball teams and go out in PE and play softball. They would throw me out in the third right field, and I would just pray that a ball didn't come my way because I was going to be embarrassed that I couldn't catch the ball, I couldn't throw the ball. So, but you did have a lot of the jockey people hanging out together. You had a lot of people from Mexican descent, but now it's kind of funny, and I have to say maybe 20-25% of school from Mexican descent, but back then there was not the big racial divide. We all got along with each other. We didn't even think about, oh, so-and-so is Mexican or anything like that, because we all got along, we grew up together, and that was okay. So that does seem to be a little bit different in that respect. So, and then there were the nerds and the theater geeks. That's kind of where I hung out with. So definitely small town vibe and not a lot of stuff going on, but it was okay. And again, I said there were miles of cornfields, alfalfa fields, cotton fields separating the towns. And in between where I lived and the high school, you had probably about 4 miles, 5 miles, and there were all alfalfa fields to get to the school if you had an event. And a lot of the times you would go on Friday night, you would go to a football game, and then afterwards there would be a high school dance, which was always fun. Like I would go, I wasn't really into the football game, but it was just kind of fun to hang out and then go to the dance. I don't know if they do dances anymore at high schools, honestly, except for like prom or homecoming, but that was the big kind of thing that we did for entertainment. So there are a lot of things also that happened in the 70s. It seemed like the monsoons were more intense, and we used to have bigger dust storms. Now today they call them haboobs. Basically that's fancy word for a dust storm. And man, if a dust storm came through, don't go outside, because you're going to be blasted by tiny little sand pellets, and you could really feel it. But it was very difficult when you were driving, and still today you could get a dust storm. And it seems like the type of storm that you see on the road that is worse is on Interstate 10 between Phoenix and Tucson. You're getting a lot of those still today, but in the 1970s and 80s it seemed like you had dust storms more often, and it did seem that it would be more rain back then. Now, I just did a video on monsoons. I did not go all the way back to the 70s and 80s to see if the rainfall was different, but it did seem that way. So the weather phenomena, now, it was always hot. Always. Phoenix is always hot. Now, they keep saying, global warming, it's boiling in Phoenix. What's happened in Phoenix, though, like in the 70s and 80s, it seemed like it did cool down a little more overnight. Now, I don't want to say cool, but when it's 117 during the day, if it gets below 100 at night, that seems cool. But now it seems like the heat lingers all the time, and it doesn't really get as cool overnight. I could be wrong. That could just be the bias of how I felt. I think, though, that the reason that is happening is because of the cement jungle. They're building more roads, more houses, all that traps the sun during the day, and it does seem like it's more hot, and it does seem like the heat goes all day long. So if you are thinking of bringing your kids and letting them grow up in Phoenix, that issue is still going to be the same. Now, another thing that was always a big deal, and the always thing we didn't like about growing up in Phoenix, is we would be jealous of our friends that lived in other states, because when school was out in the summer, we actually used to think when I was young that school was out in the summer because it's too hot to go to school. You had to stay inside. So when we realized this wasn't true, that other kids growing up in the Midwest or California or Florida, it was great in the summer to be off school because you were out riding your bikes and playing baseball and hanging out with your friends all day. But not us. It was very too hot. Now, it's funny because we did live in a fourplex in Chandler off of Ray Road between Alma School and Chandler Boulevard, which is now full solid both sides of houses and stuff. But there was empty fields, and the weeds would grow up. The weeds would be like tall, like 5, 6, and occasionally there's these little paths and coveys in the weeds. And so this is the kind of stuff that my brother and I used to play. We would make a weed house, so we would go out and play in the weed house and bring our little concoctions of lotions and stuff that we mixed together and play in the weed houses. And then one day you'd go out and they plowed the field and your weed house was gone, and you'd be totally disappointed until about 3 months from now, and the weeds would grow up again, and you would have a new series of weed houses. So now, again, was this because we were just poor, this is how we played, or is that the difference between 1970, 1980? I can't tell you, because I didn't hang out with the rich kids back then. I don't know what they were doing, but I know my brother and I played in a weed house. But there were many other fun things you could do, and you still can do them today. Like, for instance, my dad was very into going to the lake. We always had a boat. So you could take your boat onto Canyon Lake or Saguaro Lake on a Saturday anytime and launch your boat and spend the day at the boat, on the boat. But today, and I haven't had a boat in about 15 years, but I did have boats, and in the early 2000s when I was taking my kids out in the boat, if you don't get to the lake by like 7, 8 o'clock, they close the boat launch. You can't take it out because it's so crowded, and then you got to wait until people leave, maybe 2, 3 in the afternoon. You can put your boat out. But in the 70s and 80s, you could not take you could put your boat on the lake any day. Another thing that my dad was into that he took us to do as children was like quad motorcycles, although they weren't quads in the 70s. They were like the 3-wheel motorcycles, and you can pretty much go in the wintertime. You'd go out in the desert and ride, and in the summertime you would go up to like Flagstaff. Now we had a place at Mormon Lake, so we were always riding around, but you could take your motorcycle, your off-road motorcycle, pretty much anywhere in the woods and ride, because there weren't 10,000 other people on an ATV in the woods. It was very rare you would come across somebody else. So because the woods were not overcrowded, you could ride anywhere. Now it's very restricted. There are a lot of roads that are closed to motorized vehicles up north. So, that's good because there's so many, but it didn't really matter because there weren't that many in the 1980s. So there was more stuff like that for you to do. Now, one more thing that you would do is a lot of us went to church. Like I was raised Catholic, so we would go to catechism on Sunday and then to church. My mom would drop us off. I don't know if people go to catechism anymore, but I do still go to church, and I know there is a lot of church activities. I just don't think that's as prevalent in Phoenix as it was back in the day. So now another thing that happened is we were a very small school. By the time I was in high school, I was kind of tired of everybody knowing your business, because you're small, everybody knows. Anything happens in your family, the whole school knows about it the next day, and that kind of got to me, although some people don't mind that. So when I graduated high school and went to Arizona State University in the early 1980s, it was great, because at that time, ASU only had 40,000 students. Now I have no idea what they're up to today. They're probably more like 80,000, but suddenly I was at a campus where nobody knew who I was, what was happening, and I thought it was great. You could go to a class where there's like 100 people in one of these lecture halls, or you could have a smaller class of 30 to 40 students where you would make some friends, but I did like feeling like nobody was noticing me. Now maybe today it would be a little bit different, but it was certainly the small town vibe in the tiny town. By the time I was a junior and senior in school, that bothered me. Now, of course, it wasn't so bad when I was in elementary school, but those things are something you don't find today, because now all of the high schools have, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 students. I'm sure the high schools are going to be similar to how I felt at ASU back in the 1980s. Now, here are a couple other differences. Back in the early 1980s, there were not all sorts of industries or opportunities for you to find jobs. So when I was a student at Arizona State University, a lot of the students that were graduating would leave, and they would interview all over the country because there was not a lot of industry here. There was certainly not the tech hub that it's become today. So to me, that is a definite advantage living in Arizona today versus the 70s and 80s, is that you could graduate with just a high school degree or a bachelor's from ASU, say, and there are so many varieties of jobs and industries and technologies that you could work in just about any field and any trade, and you wouldn't have to move out of state. So that is definitely a plus. The other thing that's the same, of course, is the heat. It's very hot in summer. Now it's hot in the summer. Back in the 70s and 80s, we did adjust, but like I said, it was disappointing as a child to not be able to go out and play in the summertime and ride your bikes. But now you could go out in the pool. That was very fun. I didn't have a pool back then, so it wasn't an option, but kids today, a lot of these newer homes have pools, and so that's something nice that the kids could do that we couldn't do, or you could if you weren't poor. Another thing that a lot of the kids like to do was have a horse or cows or chickens. I once said to my dad, can I get a horse? Because we lived on an acre. In fact, this is kind of interesting too. When we moved to Gilbert in about 1975, my dad bought a house on an acre and then another house on an acre. And I'm like, here's this city guy want a house on an acre, and I think it was just part of the reason of escaping New York was so he could have a little bit of room and to get away from the crowds, which is ironic because today in 2025 the crowds are so intense here in Phoenix, but they weren't at the time, and actually when my father passed away in the early 2000s, still was not that overcrowded. So a lot of the people were into horses, and you can still find horse property in like Chandler and Gilbert and Queen Creek if you are into horses. My my ex-husband actually lives in a place in Chandler today where there are 2.5 acres and there are horses. So if you want to have your kids exposed to that, there are some opportunities for that today. Now, there are more opportunities where I live now. I live in Sedona, but I'm very close to Camp Verde Valley, which has Cottonwood, Rimrock, Camp Verde, Clarkdale, and Cordville. So if you want a house on acreage and you want to have a horse, that might be a good choice for you to move up to one of the northern Arizona towns. In fact, it's funny that Camp Verde kind of reminds me a lot of what Gilbert was like in the 1980s. Camp Verde today, and probably similar population. I think it's like 10, 12,000 in Camp Verde and Cottonwood. So that might be why I'm feeling that, because you don't have the, roads of cornfields and cotton fields, but you do have a lot of the houses that have homes with the horses, and I can see the high schools are smaller. It kind of reminds me of what Gilbert High School was back in the days. The other big difference, again, I addressed it, like the crowds, the intense population, the fact that you want to go anywhere and the traffic is intense any time of the day. It used to be like rush hour, it was bad. And it used to also be bad in winter because you had snowbirds, which were winter visitors. So you would notice a big difference in the traffic. In the summer, it had alleviated quite a bit. Now it seems like there's no difference winter or summer, and that's probably because there's still winter visitors, but the proportion of them out in the roads are way smaller because there's just so many more people here. So those things are going to be similar. The hot summers, the crowds everywhere. Another thing, like if you wanted to go to McDonald's, and that's the other thing too, back in the day, you didn't go out to eat. You didn't go out to fast food. Very rarely. Like, we would go out to a restaurant to eat maybe on somebody's birthday, so maybe 5 to 8 times a year the family would go out to eat. And fast food would be something that we do. My mother would take us to fast food when my dad would go out on a hunting trip, right? That was like, ooh, fun, daddy's not here, let's go have some fast food. If you would go to the drive-thru, you could usually just pull right up or maybe wait one car ahead of you to get to the window. And now you go to the drive-thru, you see these restaurants. And it's every restaurant, even like crappy Burger King, right? With their like 2 lanes of cars and they wrap all the way around, and there's like 30 cars just to get a flippin' hamburger or a bean burrito, So those things definitely are never going to go back to the one car ahead of you in the drive-thru. That's definitely probably something you're never going to be able to recreate. So that's it. That's basically the differences of growing up in Gilbert and Chandler in the 70s and 80s to what it would be like today. They have many more schools, many more programs, many more students, many options for careers, so many different places to live. I think the population is more affluent. Now, maybe the entire population of the world is more affluent today than it was in the 70s and 80s, and maybe it's because we grew up a little bit poor, but those are the big differences of Phoenix and Chandler in the today. And also that if you're thinking, oh, I would like to recreate that small town experience, there's still many opportunities here in Arizona if you would live to northern Arizona, like I said, Camp Verde, Cottonwood, Rimrock, Prescott Valley. So that's about it. My name is Dawn Dickinson. I am a real estate agent in the state of Arizona. If you're ever interested in moving to Arizona, give me a call or a text or an email, and I would love to have a conversation about buying or selling a home. I primarily sell where I live now, Sedona, Verde Valley, Flagstaff, Prescott Valley, but I do have an entire network of friends who are real estate agents in the Phoenix area, and if you were interested in moving to Phoenix, I could set you up with someone great. I did live in Phoenix for about 55 years before I moved back to like Flagstaff in 2018 and in Sedona in 2019, and I also went to northern Arizona in the 90s and got a master's degree from NAU, but I don't really sell that much in Phoenix right now. I can certainly hook you up. So again, my name is Dawn Dickinson. The channel is Living in Northern Arizona. I have my contact information in the description below. If you would ever like to reach out, call, text, or an email, I will get back to you.